session of the Center for the Economics of the Internet. It's our great pleasure today to have with us Chairman Richard Wiley, formerly of the Federal Communications Commission. Just a couple of brief housekeeping notes before we get started. If you have questions today that you would like to submit via Twitter, it's at Hudson Institute, one word, and the hashtags are hashtag FCC policy or hashtag future FCC. And as we go through today's program, we'll be very happy to accept questions submitted via Twitter. We also would like to welcome our C-SPAN audience today. We're very pleased to have C-SPAN cover this event, and our guest today, Mr. Wiley, knows a great deal about the evolution of C-SPAN over time, has appeared many times. For those of you in our audience, there is a printed bio of Mr. Wiley, and for those of you on C-SPAN or watching on our web coverage, I invite you to go to Mr. Wiley's law firm, Wiley Rein, WileyRein.com and look up his bio. It is quite extraordinary. I will simply say that Mr. Wiley is known to everyone as the Dean of Communications Law in the United States, perhaps in the world. He is both gracious and graceful. He's been a wonderful friend throughout the years. If you want to know anything about what's going on in the communications law sector, Mr. Wiley is likely a good person to ask. And we're very pleased to have him join us at the center today for what I'm sure will be a lively discussion. And we're going to talk about the current FCC and the future of the FCC. And I think there's no better topic to lead off with than let's call them rumored changes of the head of the FCC. Dick, would you like to comment on what the latest rumors of the week are?
Well, Harold, first of all, it's nice to be with you. As always, I've always enjoyed my relationship with Harold Furt Scott Rothen here at the Hudson Institute, and thank you very much for being here, and C-SPAN as well. I've heard the same rumors that you've heard, and I think those rumors are out there that perhaps the chairman might leave at some time in the near future. I don't know if they are true. I don't have any inside information on that. I think the reason you hear those is because communications is such an important aspect of our economy, of our life. The FCC obviously regulates all interstate communications by wire and radio wave, so it's a very important agency, a lot more so than when I was there, Harold, and even when you were there. And to the credit of Chairman Janikowski, there's been a lot of activity going on at the commission, so people are concerned that you'd have a change in leadership, what that would mean to pending issues at the commission, the pending prerogatives of this chairman. This chairman's been very active in the whole broadband field, I think, promoting broadband, high-speed internet access, if you will, promoting reform of the Universal Service Fund, and also the spectrum auctions matter, which I'm sure we may talk about in the future. Now, we're not going to have a change in administrations. We're not going to have a Republican coming in to take his place. If he were to leave, we'd have somebody who presumably would have some of the same philosophy and that he might have. But nonetheless, would he have, or he or she have different views, to have some different initiatives, some different prerogatives, and we don't know. So if I've got a pending matter, and by the way, everything we're going to talk about, I'm probably involved at the commission, have clients involved in, so I'm concerned about if Chairman Janikowski were to leave. And hopefully that's not going to happen, but it could.
Are there any names that you're hearing about potential replacements?
Well, other than you and me, probably about everybody else that's out there, but you do hear a lot of good names, people who have been veterans of the commission in the past or veterans of past communications activities. People like Tom Wheeler, Karen Kornblue, two existing commissioners, excellent commissioners, Commissioner Clyburn and Commissioner Rosenworcel. Larry Strickling, who's head of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration at the NTIA. Bill Lake, who's head of the Media Bureau at the Commission. Lots of names are out there, and they'd all be very competent and very good people to work with if the chairman decides to leave. And I don't want to spread the rumors that he is leaving, because I don't honestly know.
Hypothetically, if the chairman were to leave, or just based on your experience watching the commission over the years, what is the usual time frame between when a chairman announces that he's leaving and when you have a new chairman in place?
It takes months. I look at the FCC as the center of the universe for me, and Harold, perhaps for you, but even in an ongoing administration such as the Obama administration, there are a lot of appointments that had, and we've seen cabinet officials, how long it takes to get them in, so therefore you're very likely to have an interim chairman. If Chairman Janikowski were to leave, I would think one of the existing commissioners would be serving in his place for, I would say, up to 6 months, maybe longer. I remember Reed Hunt came in one time and took almost a year in the Clinton administration before he came in, if you recall. Yes. That period of time. We may be, under a different watch for a while if the chairman were to leave.
Dick, you've watched the commission over the years. How would you characterize some of the changes that have gone on and just how the commission operates, the relationship among the commissioners, the collegiality? How would you characterize the changes at the commission over the past 10, 20 years or so?
Well, first of all, as far as collegiality goes, it does vary between administration, between, I think, chairman who set the stage. I think to this chairman's credit, I think the commissioners, while they're quite split on their philosophy, their regulatory philosophy, I think they all get along personally well. I think it's to their credit. I don't see any, major splits that way. I think the people seem to realize they're adults over there, and I think that's all to the good. Yeah, I do see, a lot of differences in the commission that I regulated and the one today, in the sense that communications has become so important to the FCC, and you do have the open meeting law, and they're not able to talk more than they have to have you can't have a majority of the commissioners, 3 commissioners meeting together, and I think that's unfortunate. So you see a lot of it being done by the staff. I think, I'm all for openness and transparency, but I think it would be good if these people could meet and talk together and understand each other a little bit better than they do. Also, there's been a change, a remarkable change, starting around the Clinton administration, and that is that the minority commissioners, Republicans in this case, those appointments are really made by the Hill. The president makes them, but they really look to the Hill for them. In the old days, you tended to have the president make all the appointments. When I was chairman, I would be called about possible Democratic appointments, and so you tended to get people who were a little closer in their philosophy. Today, I think you have pretty wide disparity between the commissioners and their viewpoints. Republicans tend to be more market-oriented, more deregulatory oriented, and Democrats on the other side of the aisle. They all are right-thinking people, but they just have their strong differences in that regard. I don't think that was so true when I was chairman. I had many, back in the old days, I had some of the Democrats were probably more conservative than I was.
I can think of a name or two.
Yeah. Well, Jim Quello, who was appointed 4 times as a Democratic commissioner by different Republican presidents, was, very, very conservative.
Yes. You mentioned the open meeting rule, and I've heard rumors about possible legislation to address that.
Yes, you hear that all the time, but it's hard to be against openness, and what I would like to see is some possibilities of the commissioners getting together for non-decisional discussions, at least, to kind of frame the issues and work out some of the differences, understand how their colleagues feel about it. I think that would be an advancement. I'm not sure that it's going to happen, because when push comes to shove, it sounds like you're voting to keep somebody from Nebraska from coming in to see what's going on at the commission, when really it's probably people like myself that are over there watching those meetings, and people who are pretty, I think, up to date on what's going on at the commission. But nonetheless, openness is a good concept. I would just try to be a little flexible.
I must say, on a personal note, I think I'm the only person in Washington who actually likes those rules. But might have been my personal experience there.
Well, I was there under both. It changed during my chairmanship, so I remember what it was like. The meetings were very interactive. The staff would be sitting out in the audience just like this one and be, interacting with the commissioners. You really had to go prepared at the meetings, and it was, very ad hoc, and I think, therefore, very intellectually stimulating. Today, as I see the commission meetings, they're very scripted. Everybody makes their little statements, and they're good statements, but nonetheless, I would rather see more interaction. And so what I always wait for is the press conference after the meeting, when you actually have somebody responding to reporters' questions. And some of the reporters here are nodding. I think they know what I'm talking about. But, this is the system we've got, so you live with it.
Well, I agree with you about the open meetings. They have become very scripted, and just with a report from the Bureau, and I don't know why. Let's move on to some of the issues before the commission, and I'm going to start with an issue that that was there when I was at the commission, that was there when you were at the commission, and it'll probably be here 50 years from now, and that's media ownership.
Oh, yes.
Dick, why do we still have these rules?
Well, first of all, we ought to say what the rules are. We're really talking about the broadcast ownership rules for some of the people out there in the audience, perhaps in the C-SPAN audience. They really control how many stations any one entity can have in a market, whether those stations, broadcast, television or radio, can be co-owned with, let's say, a newspaper, and they've been around for a long, long time. And admittedly, I put in 1975, my commission put in the newspaper broadcast cross-ownership rule. And at that time, we thought newspapers might dominate the existing and developing television industry. And of course, that's pretty ridiculous by today's standards, that newspapers have had great economic concerns in this country. And yet provide, I think, a very important service. I think that rule is greatly outmoded. We have them, I think, because there's a lot of lethargy. It's hard to get rid of rules. It's easier to put them in once you put them in. One thing I'd learned today, I'd have sunsets on rules, because once you put them in, constituencies grow up about them. And there are a lot of people out there that want to regulate broadcasting, and it is the one industry that, in the media field that is regulated, and I think it's the one industry that has the most economic and marketplace problems today. After all, broadcasting is largely a one-channel service. When we talk about digital television, they've been able to have some multiple channels, but they're only 2 or 3 perhaps. And I think broadcasting is primarily advertising supported. We'll get into the fact that they've actually created a second stream of revenue in some instances, but that's compared to multi-channel subscription-oriented services like cable and satellite, and now the telephone industry. Broadcasting has its real troubles out there, and I think that they could really stand a dose of deregulation. Congress in 1996 decided to mandate the commission in the 1996 Telecommunications Act, mandated the commission to look at its existing rules every 4 years to determine whether those rules are still necessary in the public interest. And so the commission, it was originally 2 years, and then now it's quadrennial reviews. The commission moves very slowly in those quadrennial reviews. For example, It's now working on the 2010 quadrennial review. This is 2013, I need not remind you. So they have to get it started by 2010. They got around to starting it, and then it struggles through. And we can talk about the details of that, but it's a very slow process, and there are constituencies. There are a lot of people are concerned about consolidation, both on the commission and off the commission. Therefore, it's tough to get the rules changed. Plus, there is a Third Circuit Court of Appeals that for 9 years has really had authority and jurisdiction over the commission's handling of these rules, has been very critical of the commission's reasoning and its efforts to change the rules in the last two quadrennial reviews. And the commission has not been able to get any changes through, any deregulatory changes through, which I think is a real shame. Currently, the current thought by this chairman has been to eliminate the newspaper radio rule. Now, I want to say again, I have clients in this area. So I've represented the Newspaper Association of America and a lot of broadcast stations, so my views should be looked at in that context. But these are my views, my personal views. I think it'd be great to have the journalistic tradition, more news and local affairs, available to radio stations. And I think that would be good for a newspaper to be a radio station. By the way, I don't think there'd be a huge outpouring of transactions if that rule were to change. I don't think that it can be truly justified today. Even the Third Circuit has said that a blanket prescription on newspaper broadcast ownership doesn't make sense anymore, but they have been, as I say, critical of the way the FCC attempted to change the rules. So get rid of newspaper radio. That'd be the one proposal that the Janikowski Commission has made. Also to basically allow newspaper television cross ownership essentially in the top 20 markets of the country. There are some finite details that I won't bore the audience with. That's been the rules since 2008 and was again upset by the Third Circuit, but I think that the Commission recently adhered to it in the Tribune bankruptcy and allowing the Tribune, which has major cross-owned interests in the top 20 markets, to allow them to continue in that regard. So I think the Commission would propose that change. Well, people have come out of the woodwork to say that's going to, end Western civilization as we know it. I don't think so. I think it'd be very good. In fact, I think it should go beyond that. Another rule is duopoly. It's very hard to have two television stations in the same market under the Commission's rules, because you can't own two of the top four, and you have to have at least 8 independent stations out there in any duopoly transaction that occurred. That means in the smaller, middle-sized markets where broadcasters are really hurting, it's very difficult to have those transactions occur. I think it's a shame. As a result of that, Harold, what's happened is broadcasters have found ways to develop, I think, transactions that could get around the rules, so to speak, or maybe that's not the right way to say it, but at least can be justified within the current rules. That is, one station, stronger station, might provide advertising, sell advertising for a weaker station, or they might provide backroom support for them, so-called joint sales agreements, so-called shared services agreements. The Commission recently, in its proposal, is I think, going to try to crack down on the joint sales agreements in television, as they have in radio. I think that's too bad. I think those agreements have helped to bring news into smaller markets where the stations haven't got the resources financially to provide that news. And I personally like to see JSAs continue, and certainly as shared services agreements, which the Commission doesn't have a proposal on currently, continue. I'd also like to, frankly, have duopolies straight and allow them to occur. So I think changes are needed in these rules. I hope they occur. I'm dubious about it. This chairman hasn't had, I think it's fair to say, a lot of emphasis on media interests. He has made these proposals. I don't know whether he's going to follow through on them and finish it up. The commission at some point is going to have to put a finish on the 2010 quadrennial in order to get time to start on the 2014 quadrennial, which is going to be coming along. So I hope these changes are made. I think it would help broadcasting be stronger. Broadcasting is still important service. You look at what happened in Sandy when a lot of the mobile towers failed power-wise. Broadcasting was able to get through. And when tornadoes are coming, people watch their broadcast stations. Local news is still very important. If you looked at the top 200 entertainment programs, they're provided by broadcasters. You may be watching them on cable or satellite or mobile devices, but they're still initiated by broadcasting. So broadcasting is still a service that I think is worthwhile maintaining in this country. And I don't think the FCC disagrees with that, but I think they're having a hard time coming up with rules that people can agree on. The commission is very split. The Republicans would like to make these changes I've talked about. I think some of the Democratic commissioners have more problems with them, more problematic from their standpoint. So we'll see what happens.
Nick, let's talk a little bit about the process of the media ownership reviews. When you were chairman, if there was an issue, you might start a proceeding and it could possibly have been completed in 6 or 9 months. When I was on the commission, we had media ownership reviews supposedly every 2 years. They probably, from start to finish, were no more than 12 or at the outside 18 months. Today, uniquely for media ownership reviews, there are FCC-sponsored studies. We don't do this for any other type of, or very rarely for other proceedings. There seems to be, in the past decade, obligatory field hearings on media ownership. Why is media ownership review treated differently? And perhaps as a result, these proceedings go on for 3-4 years if they ever get completed at all. Why do they have to be different?
Well, one thing is the regulatory wheels grind slowly. You know that on any process, any type of issue. Number two, broadcasting is important. And there are people out there that care about it, and they really, even the people who object to any changes in the broadcast regulations, it's because they think it's important. They think, and I'll say this: I think this country has relatively low minority ownership of broadcast stations. I think that's too bad. I agree with some of the concerns that people have in that regard. I'd be for incubator programs in which stronger stations owned could help minorities get started. I was favorable of a tax certificate in which you could get a tax deferment for a minority ownership. I'd like to see more ownership, but the truth is, the real answer is access to capital. I can't own a television station, in all due respect. I don't have the capital to do it, and I think a lot of minorities and a lot of average people can't own a television station, and law of physics limit the number of stations that you can have in a marketplace. So given the fact there are relatively fewer stations than people would like to have, it means that when you come to take up these issues, they become very tortured, they become very, I think, controversial, and there is constituencies out there that are going to lobby the commission. By the way, Congress gets into the act in a big way on this, writing to the commission, telling the commission don't make any changes in these rules, and I think therefore it's been almost impossible to get changes through.
Dick, you spent many years on the digital television transition. And
I might, before we get to that one,
Sure.
I might want to talk about one other aspect, retransmission consent.
I was going to get to that, but
Okay, you want to get to that later? Let's go to digital.
I was going to go in a slightly different
All right,
order.
let's go to digital. Go
I
ahead.
thought that
Yeah.
I'm trying to be a little historical here. So You spent many years on the digital transition. You headed up a federal advisory committee on it, and it ultimately came to fruition. Now we have digital television, and why don't you tell us a bit about possible new standards for
Okay.
digital?
The standard that many of the folks out here, and certainly myself, grew up with, the so-called NTSC standard, was set way back in 1941, if you could believe that, and it was colorized in 1954. In the 80s, late 80s, I was asked by the chairman of the FCC to head up a federal advisory committee to look into the idea of advanced television, so-called high-definition television. We didn't talk about digital in those days. That digital transmission of broadcast signals was really not conceived of in the 80s, or at least was not feasible. And so our committee started out to try to develop a new television standard that was being worked on in Japan and in Western Europe, and I saw high-definition television for the first time and seeing some of their efforts, which were quite noteworthy. But they were analog. They were the older transmission. They weren't the transmission of computers, the digital transmission. Our advisory committee was private sector oriented. We reported to the FCC, but my view was to look for the best in technology. So we started an international competition to pick a new standard, and we had an entity come forth with digital transmission possibility, General Instrument out in California. And many of the other entities seeing that and perceiving that it was feasible and that would be a better signal came in and changed their analog systems to digital. We tested those systems under very objective standards in a laboratory that had been built in Alexandria, Virginia. And this took many years. And there were 7 systems tested, including the Japanese analog system, and the American digital systems tested better. After the tests were over in the early 90s, I really had those digital systems had been developed sort of on the fly, and I gave them a choice of either improving their systems so they could be the basis of the new standard, or maybe getting together and have a single best of the best elements system, so-called Grand Alliance. And that's what happened ultimately. To make a long story short, all the systems, the digital systems, got together, formed a single system, was built, tested by us again, took another couple of years, and finally in 1995, after 9 years of work by our advisory committee, we recommended a standard which the FCC essentially adopted. And that standard was put in. It took another 10 years for the United States to transition over to digital because we couldn't disrupt the existing analog system. We gave every broadcaster 2 channels, you remember, and you could watch your analog, and then some of them were beginning to do digital and on a different channel. Ultimately now, all of these stations have converted. There are some low power stations that haven't converted, and we have the digital standard coming. There was a lot of confusion. I think consumers were a little uncertain as to how to get the new digital channels, to rescan their television sets, but that's pretty much behind us. Just as we gotten through this, guess what's happening now? The idea of maybe another standard, because technology moves so much faster. We're not going to have 50 or 60 years of this standard, no matter how good it is. And you've all got high definition sets. I've got one that hangs on my wall, which was always my dream, to have a widescreen system. My wife didn't want a great big box sitting in the living room, so having it on the wall, it's been great, I think, for sports and for entertainment and news. A lot of the local stations are doing their HD, their news in HD, which is wonderful. And now we're coming through the idea of ultra high definition, and also to have a new standard that might have greater throughput in order to provide not only broadcasting, but maybe broadcasting to mobile and handheld devices. Because what we're realizing is people want communications. They want to receive programming where they are when they want it. So a lot of particularly younger people are watching, they're getting their news they're watching their programs, carrying it on their iPhones. And that's the world that we live in. So I think in the next 5 to 10 years, I can't predict how soon it'll be, we will have possibly another standard that'll have to be worked out at the commission. And, that I think will give much more, I think, make the whole availability of digital bits much broader, and I think it will give the United States and the world, indeed, many more video and digital services, which is going to be good. But if that happens, it's probably not going to be backward compatible. That is, we're all going to have to go out and buy new sets. And so therefore, I don't think it's going to come as fast as some of the technologists are saying to us. Some of the engineers are telling me, it's going to be 5 years. I'd say it'd be toward the end of the 10-year cycle, because we just can't disrupt American viewing habits, and we're not all going to want to go out and spend another $1,000 or $500 or whatever it's going to cost on a big set. But when people see, as I have seen, ultra-high definition television, we were just talking about it earlier today, it is really spectacular. It's in an experimental way, but I saw HDTV that way, and there's always something better coming along. And that's one of the great things about electronic communications and digital communications, folks. There's always going to be something better, and you have to be willing to go with technology and allow the best to be available to the country. So I think it's going to happen, Harold. And maybe if this had happened, if timing in life is everything, if we had had this happening, maybe you wouldn't have to go through this laborious spectrum auction that we're going to talk about. But that's not going to be the case, because it's a decade away, as I say.
Well, why don't we move on to the spectrum auction? The commission has a notice of proposed rulemaking that it issued last fall for a new spectrum auction, consistent with new statutory authority from Congress to hold such an auction. How do you see that playing out, and what do you see as the timelines of when an auction is actually likely to take place?
I think it's going to be a very complex proceeding. Basically, what we're talking about is the FCC developed, to its credit, by the way, the National Broadband Plan for the country. And that plan called for 500 megahertz of spectrum to be made available for mobile wireless. And given the explosion in tablets and mobile smartphones, I mean, I think that was certainly something that we all recognize maybe had to be done. And one part of it was 120 megahertz would come from broadcasting. And so Congress followed through and passed the spectrum auction statute. And it relies basically on voluntary participation by broadcasters. Nobody is forcing broadcasters to go out of business. But it does give broadcasters three options. Number one, they can turn in their license and be paid for it. Number two, they could share a license with another station. For example, two public broadcast stations struggling to be able to stay in business because it's always difficult for them, or two smaller stations struggling, would get together, share a channel, and make the other channel available in the auction and get paid for it. And the third way would be to move from UHF band, the higher part of the frequencies, down into the VHF, which are less favored in digital television. Quite the reverse, by the way, in the old analog, where the Vs were the gold standard and the Us were not so good. It's quite reversed, just the way the technology works out, and be paid for it as well. It remains to be seen whether enough broadcasters are going to participate. The FCC will get that 120 megahertz. I would tend to be a little skeptical about it. I think it'll be less than that. I can't tell you how many. There have been some broadcast groups that say they do want to participate. Others are keeping their powder dry, and you don't know until the spectrum auction really begins who's going to get out there. We'll just have to wait and see. For the broadcasters that are not participating, for the big, strong broadcasters that exist, what's their concern about this? I mean, you could say this auction is a benefit to them because It's going to take away some of the competition. Some of the weaker stations that are moving into the auction will no longer be there. But their problem is a concept called repacking, because we want to create nationwide spectrum bands for the mobile services. We may have to move broadcast television stations once again. We just moved them, and as timing again is everything in life. We just moved them in 2006 for the digital transition. It's too bad we couldn't have done this all together, but technology doesn't work that way. Public policy doesn't work that way. So we're going to have to move them again confusing the public. Some of these stations will have to be repacked. They'll have to be moved to a new area. They'll be compensated for it, hopefully. The Congress has set aside $1.75 billion to pay for the broadcasters who have to move, because it's costly to do that, changing their antenna and what have you, and move to a new location. So we'll see how it works out. It's a very complex spectrum auction that the commission contemplates. For the first time, I think, just about in history, it's going to have a forward-looking auction and a reverse auction going on simultaneously. And they'll have consecutive rounds in which broadcasters will be asked, will you sell your station for this amount? And they'll say yes. Then they'll move it down one and say, will you sell it for this? Yes. And then, will you sell it for this? No. They'll move out. And meanwhile, the wireless guys will be asking, will you pay this much? And those are both going on together. And nobody knows, how this will work out. I give the commission a lot of credit for attempting this, to carry out what Congress asked for. I know there's a lot of concern on the part of the broadcasting community. There's also concern in the wireless community as to whether they'll get the spectrum. By the way, where's the rest of the spectrum coming from? Well, it's coming from hopefully government, but there's been reluctance by some of our big departments, and we don't want to take the spectrum away from the Defense Department or from the Justice Department, because they're using it for very important services. The NTIA said maybe we could share spectrum, but a lot of mobile providers are dubious about that. So it still remains to be seen whether the 500 megahertz, if that is even the right number, and who knows if that number will ever be achieved. But I think the spectrum auction is probably going to take longer than most people think. I know the FCC is working hard at it. Really, the FCC has turned into the Federal Auction Commission right now. And they've got so many people working on this, and it is so complex. But it is certainly a good effort. That's one reason people worry about it. If the chairman left, would the new chairman come in, would he or she have the same initiatives and want to do it the same way? No one knows that for sure. But I think the spectrum auction is going to be, it's really going to be very compelling. And I'd have to say this to my broadcast friends, I represent many of them, is that I think the idea of a spectrum shortage, a spectrum need is out there. There's a reality to this. You just look at the explosion in mobile service, you see what, again, to go back to what I was saying before, people getting their communications in a mobile, handheld area, there's going to be more and more demand for what the chairman has called the oxygen spectrum requirements.
Well, you mentioned a couple of the complexities, just the complexity of the auction itself, the repacking and relocation of towers. There are many others that seem to be challenges for this auction, such as international boundary considerations.
That's a big one. That is a big one.
How much spectrum will be set aside, if any, for unlicensed? What will happen with public safety? How will they get their money out of this? Do you see all of these getting addressed in one set of rules, or do you think there will be a series of rules that will address these over time that will further lengthen the auction process?
I think the broadband plan spun off, many multiple rulemakings for the commission to consider. You mentioned the border situation for Canada and Mexico. I mean, that is yet to be worked out. In one study, they said Detroit would end up with no television stations, and that can't be, obviously. So That's a real struggle for the commission to figure out how to do that. My experience in working on the digital television thing, that the problems in working both north and south of the border are immense. They have their own systems, they have their own processes, and they're important for them to make sure their public is served. And so, I think this is still a problem to be worked out. And public safety, the commission is developing, has set aside spectrum that NTIA is now administering for a FirstNet, the public a new network to deal with things like Katrina, like 9/11. So our equipment will all work together. Fire can reach the police and can reach the safety organizations, security forces, and the spectrum will all, the equipment will all work together. And I think that's very, very important. You mentioned one other, I can't recall.
Whether there be any set aside for unlicensed, there's a big...
Unlicensed is important. The FCC has already adopted rules that allow, use of unlicensed devices in the existing broadcast band through the wonders of technology, digital technology. That is possible. Some people are talking about also unlicensed operations in the guard bands in the new spectrum auction between wireless and broadcasting. You may have seen the Washington Post editorial today on that very issue. Keep in mind the statute requires that the guard bands be no more wide than is technically necessary. So there's the limit probably to how much Wi-Fi and unlicensed devices you can put into those guard bands, I think. I'm not sure that we're going to see huge nationwide Wi-Fi systems developed for free, because keep in mind, everybody's going to have to build out those systems, and are they going to want to charge and get a value for them? So, I think all this is yet to be worked out. We'll be working on this for years, Harold, to see how this develops. It's all to the good, though, in one sense, that again, we want to try to serve the country with the best that technology offers.
Many Americans watch television either through cable or satellite, and the commission has had a proceeding for a couple of years now, retransmission consent, that doesn't seem to have gone very far. But it's a continuing issue at the commission, and where do you see retransmission going?
Let me explain what retransmission consent that Harold asked about, what we're really talking about. 20 years ago, the Congress decided to pass a statute that allowed broadcasters to get some value for their programming from what are called MVPDs, multi-channel video program distributors, essentially cable and satellite. And so today, under that statute, every 3 years, broadcasters have a choice. They can either insist on must carry, requiring those MVPDs to must carry their signal under certain limitations, or they can try to bargain for what is called retransmission consent. I'll allow you to carry my signal, I'm the broadcaster, if you pay me something for it. For a number of years, broadcasters did not get any money from cable or satellite. They got some additional channels. That's where you see MS, NBC, and FX and things like that. Those were channels that the cable bargained with the broadcasters for. But in the last 6-7 years, there started to be money changing hands, and it's become a very important second stream of income for broadcasters, a growing important stream. Now, some people are concerned about that, because what happens is when you come down to whether at the very end of a 3-year period or whatever the agreement is with cable, the broadcaster says, I want so many cents per subscriber for my program, or you can't carry it. Cable says, no, I'm not going to give you that much. They don't agree. And then the signal might be pulled, and I won't be able to watch my favorite program, or I might miss the Super Bowl or something like that. and you have occasionally service interruptions. In my own view, the statute has worked exactly as Congress intended. And you keep in mind, I've represented many broadcasters involved in retransmission consent agreements, and so my views had to be taken into that consideration. And why has it worked? Because both sides have something to gain and both sides have something to lose. Broadcasters need the coverage that cable and satellite provide. Cable and satellite want the broadcast programming. They wouldn't be paying for it if it didn't have a value. And you, on your cable system or your satellite system, you are watching broadcast programming on it. You may not be actually watching it over the air. Only about 13% of the country is watching broadcasting over the air, but they're still watching the broadcast programming. So the parties have an incentive to get together. Now, sometimes, as I say, service interruptions happen, and Congress goes crazy when that happens. And so there's a problem. But I think it's working. But in the last few years, a coalition has formed of the MVPDs who have said, hey, programming costs are rising. This is getting out of hand. We've got to change these retransmission consent rules. Well, my view is that retransmission is a relatively small piece of the puzzle. Broadcasters probably don't get anywhere near the value for their programming currently that I think that they deserve. The real reason why those things the programming costs are rising is because a lot of us are crazy about sports, and ESPN prices go up and Fox channel prices go up, and I think that's a large part of it in my personal view. So I think the retransmission consent statute ought to be left alone. The process ought to continue as it is. Having said that, in 2014, there's a arcane law called Stella, which it deals with carriage of broadcast signals into gray areas by satellite where they can't be seen otherwise, and it's allowed under certain very complex circumstances. And when Congress goes to decide whether to extend that law, which they do every 5 years. By the way, they change the name of it every 5 years, so it's hard to remember whether it's Shivia or Shiva or whatever. Now it's Stella. Sounds like one of a Tennessee Williams play, but there it is. I think that's when the whole retransmission consent situation will be challenged again. But again, I'm an advocate for it. Admittedly, both sides should negotiate in good faith. That's the requirement of the law, and I think they do. And I think they work it out. And yes, it does. In every negotiation, it tends to get right down to the wire before people make decisions. Some of the cable and satellite people said they'd like to have interim carriage going on during the course of the debate. Well, if you had interim carriage, there would be no requirement on anybody to make a deal, and therefore there wouldn't be any deals. So arbitration, interim carriage, those kinds of things, I think, are a subterfuge simply to say we don't want a deal. This is the Dick Wiley view. I'm not saying that my friends and I do have cable clients are going to agree with me on that, but that's the way I do see it. One other complexity of this whole retransmission consent situation is, what are we going to do about over-the-top programming? And what am I talking about over-the-top? Online transmissions, which is going to occur increasingly. Are those MVPDs, should they be paying retransmission consent? Do you define Netflix as an MVPD? Sky Angel is the one where the commission may have a whole new provision, a whole new proceeding on deciding who is a MVPD. And that'll be an interesting test to see how that occurs in the future. My own view is there are a lot of efforts being made now to carry broadcast programming. You've heard about IV or Barry Driller or Aereo, which is not streaming but a different system. I think it's all to get programming without paying copyright or without paying retransmission consent. Programming is expensive. It's hard to produce those things. And I think people have to be paid for the fruits of their labor. If they are not, we won't have that kind of programming. And so I think that would be bad for the country.
Let's move on to telecommunications regulation, where the commission in recent years has been focusing more and more on broadband as opposed to traditional copper wire switch networks. I assume you see this continuing on in the future, and what are some of the challenges that you see the commission facing in the broadband area?
Well, I think again, Chairman Jankowski deserves a lot of credit for the emphasis in the commission, emphasis on broadband. It is obviously important, and I think it's not only important to carriage of broadcast signals or carriage of media signals, but it's important to our economy, to e-health, e-education, all these things that contribute to the quality of life and to our economy. High-speed internet access is the name of the game. And of course, we have it in the big cities. We don't always have it in a lot of communities. Younger people have it. A lot of older people don't have it because they just don't. I think they're a little challenged by the technical complexities of it. But it's going to happen in this country just as it has happened in other civilized countries. And indeed, the United States could even be stronger in this area. So I think the emphasis is correct. Then you get into the complexities, Harold, of things like, carriage of programming and services, and whether or not there should be rules that prevent people from blocking certain services, from discriminating against certain people, and you get into the whole concept of network neutrality, and you've heard that concept talked about.
There's a major case involving an appeal of the FCC's network neutrality rules. A lot of people I talk to think there's a very high likelihood the commission is going to lose that case. And I'm not going to ask you to comment on that likelihood, but I would welcome your views on, in the event that the commission were to lose that appeal, what steps do you think the commission would take next? Well,
first of all, I should reveal that we are involved in that appeal, and we were involved in the previous appeal in the Comcast case in 2009. And basically what we're talking about is that the commission in 2005, during the Bush administration, by the way, set up 4 principles for network neutrality, and that is that consumers, I won't say them exactly, but consumers should have the right to have the applications they want, the content they want, attach the devices they want, and to have competition between their broadband providers, and not have unreasonable discrimination. The commission brought a charge against Comcast that they had discriminated, slowing down a local service in order to make the service for everybody available. Comcast said the commission didn't have authority to do that. It didn't have, and the court ruled with Comcast, and it said the ancillary authority wasn't good enough. There was no direct statutory authority. They couldn't rely on ancillary authority. So that happened in 2009. We represented Comcast in that case. In 2010, I think, or whenever it was, the Jankowski Commission changed the principles to rules, added a no blocking rule, a non-discrimination rule, a transparency rule, and those have been challenged by Verizon. We represent Verizon in this case, and that's the case you refer to that's going to be argued and probably within the next few months for the same Court of Appeals in D.C. that ruled on the Comcast case. Remains to be seen just how that will come out. I don't know, but this time the commission is saying we do have statutory authority. We have Section 706, which gives the commission authority over broadband. We have other provisions. These should apply to allow us to have these network non-network duplication rules. Excuse me, network neutrality rules. I don't know how that's going to come out. We'll see.
Okay.
I mean, it may be the court will say the commission does have authority. That's what the commission is asserting it. Maybe not.
Right.
And after that, the commission will have to move on accordingly.
I find it interesting to contrast the Commission's network neutrality rules with what went on at the ITU last year, where the United States was taking a very principled position and just don't regulate the internet and we don't really need this. And it was a very contentious ITU meeting, where you followed closely.
Yes.
Be curious about your thoughts about how that played out, and what do you see as the ITU's role going forward in terms of coordinating policy, I'll put it that way.
Well, the interesting thing about the whole network neutrality debate is that both sides claim that they are for a free internet. I mean, that's the interesting thing about it. And the other side claims that you want to restrict the internet. Well, in the international sphere that you referred to, a number of the countries like China, Russia, some of the Mideast countries want to have more government involvement in the development of the internet. They somewhat chafe about the U.S.-led involvement in the internet. They're concerned about the multi-stakeholder, private sector governance of the internet, which I think has led to the internet's wonders of the great development of it. I'm very much on the side of the United States on this. And by the way, this is one area in which Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill, this is the one area they can really agree on.
Yes.
Now, on the other hand, some Republicans point to exactly the point that you make, and that is there some hypocrisy here? We're saying, hey, wait a minute, we want a free network, but on the other hand, we want rules like network neutrality here domestically, and we don't want to have the government involved in the international sphere. I think, on the other hand, some folks who support the network neutrality rules would say there's quite a difference between those two instances, and that would be not a fair comparison. I'm probably on the side of the import of your question, saying that it would be better to have the government keep its hands off and allow the internet to continue to be the really amazing device that it is today, amazing force that it is. Just think about it, ladies and gentlemen. The internet has become, just in the last 10, 15 years, become the universal medium for communications and entertainment and what have you. And it has changed every business in the United States, and it will even more in the future. And I think that might not happen if you had a repressive government, which we're not going to have in the United States, but if you had repressive government rules internationally. I think that could impact the internet's development. It could impact our economy. I think it's a mistake. I want to commend Chairman Janikowski and Commissioner McDowell at the FCC for their strong efforts on this, and indeed the folks on Capitol Hill who have been very much endorsing what the FCC has been trying to do.
What do you see as the outcome of the ITU meeting, and where do we go from here? This was an unusually contentious meeting. It raised some issues that haven't really been addressed for about 20, 25 years, and a lot of different sides are claiming victory coming out of it. How do you see ITU going forward and international? What is its role in the internet going forward?
Well, I was disappointed by the Dubai conference, the WISIT so-called conference held in the Mideast. I think the feeling was there was not going to be a treaty coming out of it. That was the concept. There was a treaty. The United States and many of the Western countries refused to sign that treaty. I don't think that treaty is by all means the last word in this. I think it's the start of a process, but it's the start of, I think, a very troubling process that we may see more government involvement in the internet. I think that's what our government leaders are warning against, both the Republican side and the Democratic side.
Finally, let's talk briefly about a proposal for how the FCC is going to look at what will ultimately be a transition to IP. It will come at some point in time, and whether that's 5 years from now or 50 years from now, no one knows for sure, but the FCC has a request before it to take a look at this transition. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, what we're really talking about is, we had the public switch telephone network, PSTN, which has served this country for 100 years and more, but it was developed basically for voice communications, all of us making telephone calls. We know today the world has changed, again, for all the reasons we've been talking about in the last hour here. Digital, internet, IP-enabled services are increasingly demanded by the public. So therefore, whether you think the changeover from the PSTN to an all IP network is a good idea, I'm telling you here that it's inevitable. It is going to happen. The only question is when it's going to happen. Some people, by the way, say it'll happen in this decade. I've heard 2018 is a possible date, but nobody knows that for certain. The commission, to its credit, has set up a task force to look at how we make that transition. What kind of regulations do we need to ensure that rural areas, older people, poorer people, people who rely a lot on the PSTN are not going to be disadvantaged as those of us in different environments may be, as we want to get more services. We want to have a new IP, VoIP network. And AT&T, and it's a client also, has suggested there ought to be some trials that we have and to see what regulations are required. Because does it make sense to have the networks have to maintain for too long two different networks? One, again, developed for voice communications, another one developed for all kinds of communications, IP, if you will. And so I think this is going to be a continuing issue, trying to figure out what regulations need to be changed, what kind of a hierarchy do we need, what kind of a timing do we need, how do we protect the people who still rely on that PSTN. AT&T has pledged $14 billion to try to drive fiber optics into the 22 states which they serve. I think a combination of fiber optics, mobile 4G, and digital services generally, I think maybe we can find a way to provide the same kind of Kingsbury commitment that the telephone company has had to serve all of America with an effective low-cost telephone system, telecommunications system. We can still do it in the modern age, but that's going to be, I think, a challenge.
And with that, let me open up the floor to questions, and let me remind both our online and our C-SPAN audience that if you have questions, to submit them to @Hudson Institute, #FCC policy, or #future FCC, and we already have some questions here.
Oh, that's a mean one.
I'll ask
I
you.
was kidding. I couldn't see it.
Well, you might think it's a mean question. It's from Crystal High. Any predictions on which sitting FCC member would serve as interim chair if Chairman Janikowski steps down?
Well, one would have to bet on the senior commissioner. It'd be senior Democrat Mignon Clyburn, but that's the president's decision, and far be it from me to be able to make that decision. By the way, I think both are very competent and capable. I've been very impressed with Commissioner Rosenworcel in her brief time at the commission, so they both do a good job.
Questions from our audience? Yes, the gentleman right here. And please identify yourself for the audience.
Hi, Mr. Wiley. Paul Barbagallo, reporter with Bloomberg BNA. I'm curious, you discussed the FCC's authority in an increasingly broadband-centric world. Do you feel as though Congress must update the Communications Act to ensure that the FCC can continue to perform its basic functions as networks migrate to IP?
Well, here's the reality. The 1996 Act, which was the first major telecommunications legislation that Congress passed since the 1934 Communications Act that set up the FCC. It unfortunately, the timing of it was worked on for 10 years, but it came along just at the time when internet was being developed, so it barely mentions the internet. Broadband wasn't involved in it. Digital communications wasn't there. The timing just wasn't right. And so, yes, you could say it would be good to have a new communications law. Having said that, do I think it's going to happen? I think it's going to be very difficult to achieve. There are so many, again, interests involved, so many industry interests, so many public interests, and citizens groups. When you can't change the broadcast rules very easily, and just imagine when you try to write a huge new statute that involves broadband or many of the other digital services. So I think, I would foresee maybe smaller pieces of legislation. I would like to see a big new statute. I think that would make sense for the country, but I'm not sure how soon that would happen. It's now being talked about on Capitol Hill, but talk is cheap, as they say, so we'll see.
It was 62 years between the original Communications Act and the 96 Act. So
yeah, 96 Act was a very good effort, by the way. Again, it just did, I think it had been so much better if it had been about 5 or 10 years later. We would have known about the things that the Congress, to its understandable, did not know about. Did not know how important the internet was going to be, and that broadband was feasible.
as a footnote, having worked on the 96 Act as a staffer, Congress actually did know about a lot of these things, but some words were not put in for committee jurisdictional reasons.
That's all.
Yes.
Well, it does happen, doesn't it?
Yes. Next question from our audience here. We have a gentleman over here on the aisle.
Hi, Joel Burns, Temple Strategies. As we've been talking about how things have been changing and how things are regulated, do you think that the current sort of silo regulations where we have bureaus with the wireline, wireless, and media make sense in the world going forward? And if not, how should the FCC be structured to handle what we're talking about in the next few years?
It doesn't make sense anymore. You have broadcasters regulated as public trustees. You have telephone regulated as common carriers, still to some extent. You have the MVPDs, cable, and satellite somewhere in between. And yet, as we see in the marketplace today, all of them are providing functionally equivalent digital services. Broadcasters are trying to get into the world that the telephone and cable companies, cable and telephone, are competing directly, which wasn't foreseen in the 1996 Act as clearly as we see it today. So I think you do need a revision of this. I think the FCC could do a lot of that themselves, and I would like to see that occur. I think we just have to go, in my view, toward a more lessened regulation. I think that's the only way it works. And rely more on the marketplace. Yes, we have to protect public safety. We have to make sure that the disadvantaged are protected. But largely speaking, I think the forces of competition are going to provide a better answer than government services. That's my philosophy.
Got a question over here on the side.
Hi, Mustafa Naseem. I'm a graduate student at the University of Colorado and an intern at Verizon. My question is about the unlicensed use of spectrum in the guard bands or the duplex bands between LTE. And so you mentioned that the statute limits it to as not more than technically necessary or technically
required,
technically
yes.
feasible. And so the filing by Microsoft and Google requests for about up to 28 megahertz of guard band use for unlicensed spectrum, and the minimum requirement for some of the LTE functions is 10 megahertz. And I'm wondering, how do you balance out the use for unlicensed spectrum versus the innovation that comes out of licensed spectrum, such as the app economy or smartphones, and also the revenue generated from auctions? And so what's your take on how big the guard band should be, and if it's what the technically
Well, I think both licensed and unlicensed operations are important. I think the FCC has already, as I said earlier, created the possibility of unlicensed services, and I think more unlicensed services will be created through this spectrum auction. But the real reason it was set up, of course, was to get some revenue to pay for broadcasters to leave the spectrum, and somebody's going to have to, provide the revenue, basically. And once again, if you're going to build Wi-Fi services, can you make them free to the public? Isn't somebody going to have to spend a lot of money to build out those systems and to provide a service, and aren't they going to want to be paid for it? I mean, that's the reality of whether it's licensed or unlicensed. I think that's the reality. Yes, you go into some Wi-Fi spots and you get some free services, but you also pay in some services, and I think that's going to be the continuation of it. So I don't think we know how that's going to work out. I think the main thing will be is the guard bands can't be so broad beyond what the technical requirements might be to keep mobile wireless services away from broadcasting, to prevent interference. That's the fundamental.
I could add as a footnote, there is a technological and market possibility of someone bidding at auction for spectrum and then setting it up as the equivalent of unlicensed, but having charging for access to that band.
True.
I've had discussions with Professor Christopher Yu of the University of Pennsylvania about this sort of limited commons concept. We haven't seen anyone actually being willing to bid for that. That might be for technological reasons or other reasons, but conceptually someone could in fact bid at auction and set up what is the equivalent of unlicensed spectrum. In the back right there.
Hi, Katie McAuliffe, Digital Liberty and Americans for Tax Reform. So kind of two things following up on spectrum. We talk a lot about the broadcaster spectrum, commercial spectrum. Right now, about 30% of spectrum has commercial use, whereas about 70% is federally used. And there may be some debate as to what's exclusive and what's shared, but federal use pretty much preempts any other kind of use on the shared bands. So kind of what is the best strategy that the FCC can pursue in divesting some of the federal agency use spectrum? And then also when talking about competition, since we know that all these services across the board, it shouldn't be siloed, they're all competing with each other, isn't the FCC's current interpretations of competition incorrect? So when they evaluate competition in a market, they're not looking at all the proper aspects of competition.
Well, the last part, I'll just take the last part. I would agree with you on that. I mean, in all due respect to the commission, I think they have to look, for example, these broadcast rules, I think they look at what the competitive realities are today. The world has changed remarkably, and as we've talked about. On the first, say what your first question again was.
So as far as how can the FCC best pursue getting...
Yeah. Well, it's difficult because sometimes the FCC, for example, which is set up by Congress to really regulate the private use of the FCC doesn't know what the government use is. And a lot of us don't know what the government use is. You have to rely on NTIA and the whole forces over there in the federal government. We know that defense spectrum is very, very important to the security of this country. And so a lot of the use of it, I think, are unknown. I do think there's got to be more efforts made to free up spectrum and to try to have the same kind of technology-driven use of the spectrum, which conserves the spectrum. And we know it drives in the private sector because there's a profit motive to that. Those same kinds of incentives have to be used by the government. I think a lot of government people will tell you that they understand that. They've got to really employ spectrum efficiently, just as we do in the private sector. But there is, if you read a lot of the comments coming out of NTIA, it's about shared spectrum, and whether that's going to really be effective, I think is a question mark. You're shaking your head no, and I might have some agreement with that.
Technology to do that right now with time shifting and locational.
But in any case, be it a combination of shared or a combination of reallocation, I think the government's going to have to try to play by the same kinds of rules that the private sector is forced to play because of the economic elements.
We have another question from Twitter. This one comes from tech journalist John Edgerton, our old friend, yes.
Yes, I know, John.
How long can the FCC put off the MVPD decision?
Well, I think, I think they're going to have a major proceeding. I don't think you can decide on the basis of just the Sky Angel complaint that big a question of who is an MVPD. MVPDs are required to pay retransmission consent to broadcasters. I don't think they can decide that on a single complaint against a single company. I think it's a very important issue. And why is it a very important issue? Because so much programming is going to be developed over the internet. I was just talking at lunch with you, Harold, about Netflix paying $100 million for the House of Cards programming. I mean, here's a whole new competitive force that outbid the networks, by the way, for that program, both MVPD and broadcast networks, presumably. I don't know the details of the deal, but it's obvious that there's a new force out there, and over-the-top online programming and the carriage of programming is going to be increasingly important. And what are the interplay of retransmission consent and the copyright rules to that kind of a service, be it streamed or be it brought by an aerial through small antenna and a DVR hooked to the internet? All those things are going to have to be reviewed by the commission. And I think that'll be a big challenge of the next chairman, or this chairman if he decides to stay on.
And we have time for one, maybe two more questions from our audience here.
As we used to say, I've made it all perfectly clear, right?
Yes, stunned silence. Well, let me, I'll toss one up.
One last tough one, right?
Yeah, this gets to, you've observed the structure of the commission over the years, and dealing with a wide range of difficult issues. Do you think it's the current 5-member structure as an independent agency is working well, or do you think there's some issues that might be better off brought inside of an administration?
No, I still like the combination of an FCC dealing with the private sector use of the spectrum and NTIA and its cohorts dealing with the government side. And if you're going to have an FCC, yes, when I was chairman, I might have thought a one-man commissioner would have been good, but I still like the ability to get in and get a variety of viewpoints brought to it and have a bipartisanship to it if you're going to deal with the private sector. So I think the FCC system is working. I think the biggest problem is the speed of service. I think the commission, the next leadership of the commission is going to have to look at that, figuring a way to get things done. The reason why it takes so long, though, is two things: the complexity of the issues today, and the multiple interests that interact with those issues. So it's just very hard for the FCC to make its decision, but I think it's got to try.
And with that, this concludes this session of the Center for the Economics of the Internet seminar series here at the Hudson Institute. Please join us again on March 7th. Again at noon, March 7th, we'll have Commissioner Ajit Pai from the Federal Communications Commission who will come speak to us about issues before the Commission. And with that, please join me in thanking Dick Wiley for giving us just an extraordinary presentation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Harold.